The applause started before I even reached the backyard. I could hear it echoing through the open windows, scattered clapping rising like a wave. Somewhere near the grill, someone shouted, "To Harvard," followed by laughter and glasses being raised. I should have kept walking back to my car, turned the key and driven home to my quiet apartment in Chapel Hill. But I didn't. I took a breath, forced my shoulders back, and walked through the side gate into the celebration I wasn't really invited to, just expected at, like one of those decorative lawn chairs, uncomfortable but necessary. The heat clung to my skin like damp paper and the smell of grilled meat drifted through the air. My uncle's yard looked like a catalog photo, solar lights glowing even in daylight, the grass trimmed within an inch of its life, and enough folding chairs to host a suburban summit. Everyone was there. Cousins I hadn't seen in years, aunts who used to pinch my cheeks like I was still 12, and uncles who measured worth by job titles and square footage. My mom spotted me first, relief softening the lines in her face. She whispered, "Go say hi to your uncles. Dylan's here." Of course he was. The golden boy. The reason for the applause. My cousin who got into Harvard on a full ride, the family's pride and ongoing group chat subject for the past 6 months. I nodded and drifted toward the noise, clutching a plastic cup of lemonade like it could anchor me to the ground. The grown-ups had gathered in a semicircle, surrounding Dylan and his parents like they were royalty. His mom wore pearls and confidence like armor, his dad feigned modesty between boasts. Dylan himself stood tall, clean-cut, magazine cover ready. He looked exactly how you'd expect a Harvard freshman to look, bright-eyed, curated, pre-approved. And then, the moment came. Grandma Ruth, from her lawn chair thrown with a crocheted blanket over her knees despite the July heat, leaned forward just enough to deliver her trademark commentary. "Some people," she said with that voice of sugared steel, "just aren't academic." It wasn't a question. It wasn't even new. She'd said it before. About me. About others who didn't quite meet her standards. But this time, something shifted. Maybe it was the way her words landed like stones, or maybe it was because I was done swallowing them. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't make a scene. I just said, loud enough to cut through the clapping, "Funny. I'm his professor." Silence. Real silence. Not the polite kind that pauses between bites or the distracted lull before someone changes the subject. This was the kind of silence that made people aware of background noises, the squeak of a ceiling fan, a kid's laugh from down the street, the soft crackle of something forgotten on the grill. Dylan turned, slowly. His eyebrows drew together in confusion like he was seeing a ghost. "You're what?" he asked. I didn't look at him. I looked at Grandma Ruth. And for the first time, she didn't look back. Her eyes drifted past me like I was an unfamiliar painting she didn't know how to interpret. Around us, the air grew thick. No one else moved. No one filled the silence with a joke or a distraction. I reached down, picked up my lemonade, took a slow sip, and walked away without another word. I didn't need to stay for the ribs. Didn't need to hug the few relatives I actually liked. I didn't even need to see my mother's face to know she was simultaneously horrified and relieved. Horrified that I'd said it. Relieved that someone finally had. I stopped near the edge of the garden, under the shadow of a peach tree someone had planted years ago but never tended properly. The leaves were sparse, the fruit small and bitter-looking, like they hadn't been given the chance to grow. It felt poetic. The applause had stopped entirely. I could hear someone coughing behind me. Maybe Aunt Margaret. Maybe the sound of a long illusion unraveling. I stood there, breathing, not shaking for once. For the first time in years, I didn't feel invisible. I didn't feel like the blurry extra in the family photo. I felt solid. A few moments later, the sounds began to return, plates clinking, chairs creaking, conversations restarting with that strained, too loud laughter families use when pretending nothing happened. But the shift had occurred. They could pretend if they wanted. I had already said it. And no one could unhear it. I hadn't been back to a family reunion in 2 years, and I wouldn't have gone this time either if my mom hadn't guilted me with that voice she saves for holidays and hospital visits. She never actually says what she wants. She just sighs and lets the silence settle long enough for it to sound like your fault. "Everyone's asking," she said over the phone, meaning everyone will talk about me if you don't show up. I knew the drill. Smile. Shake hands. Pretend I didn't hear the comments whispered like prayers, the ones that start with, "Noah's smart, but," and end with, "You know, books don't pay the bills." I ironed my shirt twice that morning. Still had a crease I couldn't get out. I gave up, grabbed my keys, and made the short drive from Chapel Hill. My apartment there is quiet, walls lined with books, a couch too sunken to be stylish, and a desk that's more coffee ring than would grain at this point. I teach comparative literature at Duke. Been doing it for 10 years now. Assistant professor, almost up for tenure. I write. I grade. I sit on committees that argue about things no one outside academia would ever care about. I'm not flashy. Not wealthy. But I've worked hard for every inch of my life. You'd never guess that by the way my family talks. I'm the quiet cousin, the bookish one, the guy who never quite made it, not in the way that mattered to them. In my family, success comes with a corner office or a six-figure title or at least an Instagrammable lifestyle. I had none of that. Just lecture halls and second-hand furniture. Then Dylan got into Harvard. Dylan, the golden child. 6 years younger than me. All teeth and charm. I hadn't seen him since he was still in high school, fumbling with acne and confidence in equal measure. Now, suddenly, he was on a pedestal so high, the rest of us were just background noise. They made PowerPoint slides about him, literally. My Aunt Belinda once pulled up a full deck at Thanksgiving. Charts. Photos. An acceptance letter as the grand finale. Harvard, full ride, honors track. It was like he discovered the cure for cancer and ascended into sainthood overnight. No one asked what I was doing. No one even remembered I'd taught at a university. Not until Dylan showed up in my classroom. That was the twist nobody saw coming, not even me. First week of the fall semester, he walked into my comparative literature seminar. Freshman requirement for his major. He didn't even look at me twice. Just scanned the room, took a seat in the back row, and pulled out a notebook he didn't write in. I recognized him immediately. The jawline was sharper, the posture a little more confident, but it was him. Dylan Rathmore. My cousin. My family's crown jewel. I didn't say anything. Neither did he. Maybe he didn't recognize me. Or maybe he did and thought ignoring it would make it go away. Either way, I decided to treat him like any other student, no special treatment, no vendettas. Just a name on the roster. At first, he was average at best. Showed up late. Skimmed the readings. Parroted half-baked interpretations that clearly came from Spark Notes, not any actual engagement. His essays were worse. Thin arguments, poor structure, no sense of voice. I gave him a B- on his first paper and wrote extensive notes in the margins, hoping it would serve as a wake-up call. It didn't. Week after week, he slid by on charm and shortcuts. He had the smirk of someone who thought effort was optional, that brilliance could be feigned with the right vocabulary and enough eye contact. I knew that smirk. I'd seen it on half my students. But on Dylan, it stung more. Not because he was family, but because I knew he could do better. I knew what it looked like when someone didn't try. I'd spent years doing the opposite. I stayed up late grading, my eyes bloodshot and my wrists cramping. I read every paper, even the bad ones. I wrote comments that no one would ever read. I fought for students who didn't even know I was on their side. And here was Dylan, waltzing through, coasting, rolling his eyes during lectures like he had better places to be. I overheard him one day telling another student, "Lit classes are a joke. This guy doesn't even read our stuff." That cut deeper than I expected. I did read it. I read all of it. Even when I didn't want to. Even when it felt like yelling into a void. But that was the job. Not just teaching content, but caring. I didn't confront him. Didn't pull him aside or call him out. I just kept grading. Just kept showing up. He was a mirror, in a way. A reflection of what my family applauded. Confidence over competence. Performance over process. Dylan didn't see the irony. He couldn't. Not yet. By midterms, he'd improved slightly. Enough to avoid academic probation, not enough to be impressive. I still didn't tell anyone. Not my mom. Not my colleagues. I didn't want him to be reduced to a family anecdote, the way I'd been for years. The cousin who teaches somewhere, what's it called again? Duke. They always said it with a tilt of the head, like it was quaint. Like it didn't count. What they didn't know, what they never cared to know, was that Dylan almost failed that first semester. He was overwhelmed. Unfocused. Unprepared for the work he'd been so celebrated for. But I didn't let him slide. I held the line. I made him rewrite essays. I asked harder questions. I pushed him when no one else did. And when he finally started trying, when he finally leaned in and wrote something real, it was good. Not because he was gifted. Because he worked for it. That's what they missed. That's what they always missed. The applause wasn't for effort. It was for image. For the idea of greatness. Never the grind. Never the late nights or the self-doubt or the quiet resilience. Dylan had never been forced to face that. Until me. Not because I wanted to teach him a lesson. But because I couldn't keep pretending brilliance came free. My entire life, I'd watched this family throw parades for half-formed futures and ignore the ones who held everything together behind the scenes. Dylan was just the latest headliner. I was the credits they never stayed for. One night, grading late in my apartment, I found one of his essays from early on, a messy, pretentious piece filled with buzzwords and empty conclusions. I almost tossed it. But something made me keep it. Not out of spite. Out of hope. Hope that one day, he'd see the gap between who he was and who he pretended to be. That maybe, just maybe, he'd close it. The last paper he submitted was different. Tighter. More honest. It quoted Baldwin, not just for the grade, but with reverence. I could see the shift. It wasn't seismic. But it was real. I gave him an A-. Wrote fewer comments this time. Just one, really. Now this is yours. I didn't know if he'd read it. Didn't know if it would stick. But it was there. Waiting. Like I had been all along. A few weeks later, the reunion invite came. No one said Dylan would be there, but I knew. And I knew they'd clap. Knew they'd raise glasses. Knew Grandma would say something she thought was clever. What they didn't know was that the version of Dylan they praised wasn't the one who existed. Not yet. Maybe not ever. What they also didn't know, what made me finally go, was that for the first time, I wasn't coming as the invisible cousin. I was coming as his professor. And whether they liked it or not, they were going to see me. Thanksgiving came faster than I expected, tucked neatly between deadlines and department meetings, the kind of holiday that always felt more like an obligation than a celebration. My mother called me the week before. She didn't ask if I was coming. She just said, "They're all going to be there," with that familiar note in her voice, not excitement, not pressure, just a kind of tired hope. I didn't commit. Didn't say no, either. A part of me wanted to stay home, eat microwaved leftovers, and grade the stack of essays piling up on my desk. But another part, the quieter one that had stayed silent for far too long, decided I needed to look this thing in the face. Not them. The illusion. The years of polite shrinking, of letting the applause go to someone else, of pretending invisibility was dignity. I wasn't angry. I wasn't even looking for a moment. I just wanted truth in the room. And this year, I was bringing it with me. Dinner was at Aunt Cheryl's house. She had redecorated since the last time I'd been there. Everything was forest-themed, whatever that meant, plaid runners on the table, ceramic pumpkins, copper utensils no one was allowed to touch. About 20 people crowded into the dining and living room, folding chairs creaking under the weight of expectations and unspoken judgments. I arrived without fanfare, as usual. A few polite nods, a couple of murmured hellos. No one rushed over to ask how my semester was going. No one asked about the book I just contributed to, or the grant I'd helped secure for the department. They never did. I took a seat near the window, out of the way but close enough to observe. Dylan wasn't there. I'd asked my mom on the drive over if he'd be coming. She just said, "He's figuring things out," which could mean anything, ashamed, confused, free. Maybe all three. Uncle Frank made the toast, the same one every year. About how lucky we were to still gather, despite our busy lives. The table hummed with low chatter and the clinking of utensils against ceramic. Then came the real reason we'd gathered, not the food, not the family, but the ritual of achievements. The brag parade. Marissa had opened a Pilates studio. Gabe had made partner at some firm. Jenna's twins had gotten into Duke. One by one, accomplishments were laid out like offerings to the gods of validation. And then, as expected, Aunt Cheryl cleared her throat. Her voice had that syrupy, performative quality, the one she saved for leading church committees and hosting dinner parties. "We're just so proud of Dylan," she said, her hands clasped like she was delivering a eulogy. Even though he couldn't be here this year, Harvard keeps him so busy. Of course, he was recently selected to lead a seminar for incoming freshmen. Very selective. She paused, beaming. And his paper on education reform got picked up by a national journal. Polite applause followed. Some raised eyebrows. Cousin Teddy muttered, "Damn overachiever," and everyone laughed like it was charming, not exhausting. Then she turned to me. Of course she did. Her smile tightened, all sugar and lemon. And of course, she added, Dylan's success comes from a long line of academics in the family. She looked straight at me now. We all remember when you used to teach, right? How's that going? Her tone was casual, light, the kind people use when throwing darts under the tablecloth. I set my fork down. My mother froze. No one else flinched. They'd seen this play before. This was my cue. Shrug. Smile. Say something vague. Fade out. Not this time. You mean still teach? I said calmly. It's going great. I just got tenure. That got their attention. The soft murmuring stopped. A few heads turned. Tenure, someone repeated. Wait, where again? I didn't answer. Instead, I reached into my bag and pulled out a folded piece of paper. I hadn't planned on using it. I'd printed it on a whim, something to look at on the drive home, like a secret I could hold. But now I unfolded it and slid it across the table toward Aunt Cheryl. It was a copy of the journal article she'd just bragged about. Under the title was the author's name, Dylan Rathmore. And beneath that, in smaller print, Advisor, Dr. Ria Banerjee. In even smaller print, on the acknowledgement page, with special thanks to Professor Noah Caldwell, whose guidance helped shape this paper. Her face went pale. She looked at it like it might burn her fingers. Around the table, silence bloomed. Real silence. You could hear the turkey cooling in its platter. You could hear someone chewing slowly, like they didn't want to be the first to speak. I leaned back in my chair, not smug, not victorious, just tired. Tired of pretending. He's my student, I said. Has been for over a year. That seminar he's leading. I nominated him for it. No one spoke. Not Belinda. Not Frank. Not Cheryl. I didn't give them time. He's earned a lot on his own, I continued, but he nearly flunked out his first semester. He wasn't ready. He was overwhelmed. I held the line. I made him do the work. And when he finally did, it was brilliant. Not because he's gifted. Because he finally stopped performing and started asking real questions. I paused. My voice softened. I didn't say anything before, because I didn't want him to be embarrassed. But I'm tired of sitting here every year, listening to this family clap for a version of him that doesn't exist. The air in the room changed. Something about the way I said it, quiet, unblinking, seemed to strip the moment of pretense. Aunt Cheryl's mouth opened, then closed. My uncle stared at his plate. I grabbed my bag. Anyway, I said, standing up. I should go. Got papers to grade. My mom looked up at me, eyes glassy, but she didn't say a word. She didn't need to. I'd already said everything. I walked toward the door, head clear, pulse even. I wasn't angry. I wasn't triumphant. I just felt light, like I'd stopped holding something I didn't realize was heavy. And then, as I reached the foyer, someone clapped. Just one person. Ray. My cousin who teaches middle school science in Durham. She's always been quiet, overlooked. No one ever asked her much either. Then Teddy joined in. Then Gabe. It wasn't a standing ovation. It didn't need to be. But it was real. And it was enough. I left the house and got into my car, sat behind the wheel, and exhaled like I hadn't breathed in years. Later that night, my phone buzzed. A text from a number I knew too well. I heard what you did. Thank you. I don't deserve it yet. But I'm trying to. I stared at the message for a long time, thumbs hovering. Then I typed back, good. Now go write something real. I didn't need a reply. I didn't need a follow-up. Because the truth was already out. The pedestal was gone. And maybe, just maybe, we could both start from the ground up. And this time, I knew the ground beneath me was mine. A few days after Thanksgiving, I found myself standing in the used bookstore off Franklin Street again. I wasn't looking for anything in particular, just drifting, like I always did when grading papers started to feel like shouting into the void. The air smelled like mildew and forgotten ideas, the kind of scent that seeps into the spine of every book and stays there. I ran my fingers across the cracked covers until I saw it, a worn copy of Their Eyes Were Watching God. The edges were yellowed, the spine cracked. Inside, blue ink scribbles filled the margins. A dog-eared page marked the exact line Dylan had mentioned in his email: "There are years that ask questions and years that answer." Without thinking, I bought it. Took it home. Let it sit on the desk near my window where I graded, like a quiet witness to everything that had been unsaid for years. The semester picked up again, business as usual. Students filled my lecture hall with their oversized headphones and oversized confidence, sliding into chairs like they owned the place but looked over their shoulders every time I asked something that didn't have a clear answer. I started lecturing differently. I didn't notice at first, it just happened. My questions became less about interpretation and more about truth. I began letting the silences sit longer, forcing the room to hold them instead of rushing to fill them. Maybe it was because of Dylan. Or maybe I was just tired of pretending I knew everything. I'd spent so long trying to prove I belonged in my own classroom that I'd forgotten what it felt like to simply exist in it. One afternoon, a student named Arya stayed behind after class. She was the kind who took notes on paper, cramped, tidy handwriting, like she was trying to leave as little of a trace as possible. "Professor," she said, hovering near the podium, "can I ask you something? Not related to the syllabus." I nodded. "Why do people only act proud of you after you've already succeeded? Why don't they care when you're still trying?" Her voice cracked just slightly at the end, the way it does when a question is more personal than academic. The air between us thickened. I thought of my dissertation defense, how no one in my family showed up, even though I invited them. I thought of those years when I worked 2 jobs, lived above a liquor store, and wrote chapters at 3 a.m. between grading and exhaustion. No applause then. Only silence. "I think," I said slowly, "people don't know how to love someone in the middle. Trying is messy. Unfinished. It scares people. Success is easier, it's packaged. Safe. Applause-worthy. But the middle. That's where most of us live, and they don't know how to stay there with us." Arya nodded. I just needed to hear someone say that. She left without another word, her steps light but purposeful. I stood alone for a long time afterward, staring at the whiteboard still smudged with half-erased notes on Baldwin and identity. Weeks passed. I didn't hear from Dylan. I didn't expect to. Then one afternoon, a letter arrived in my mailbox, not a text, not an email, but an actual letter with a return address from Boston. Inside was a single sheet of paper. No greeting. No closing. Just handwriting, neat, unsure. "I'm sorry for how I acted. Not just that day, but before. I was afraid people would stop clapping if they knew I didn't always feel smart. You didn't humiliate me. You freed me. I didn't know how heavy the applause was until it stopped. I'm applying to the education program next semester. I want to teach. Maybe not college. But somewhere." I sat with the letter for a long time, heater humming softly behind me, the trees outside stripped bare by winter. I folded the paper carefully and slipped it inside the copy of Their Eyes Were Watching God. It stayed there, between those scribbled margins, quiet, unseen, exactly where it belonged. Later that week, I visited my mom in Carborough. Her neighborhood was quieter now, mailboxes crooked with age, sidewalks cracked like old smiles. She opened the door in slippers, flour dusting her sweater. "Didn't know you were coming," she said, stepping aside to let me in. I was in the area. She didn't press. Just went back to kneading dough like it had done something wrong. We sat in the kitchen while the oven warmed. The air smelled like cinnamon and potpourri, too sweet and too familiar. Photos lined the walls, mostly of nieces, nephews, grandkids. But tucked in the corner, almost out of sight, was a photo of me in my regalia, standing alone on the auditorium steps after earning my PhD. "I saw Dylan on TV," she said, her voice casual, like we talked about him all the time. "He was on some youth leadership panel. Looked tired. Older." I said nothing. "He wrote to your uncle," she added, "said he might take a break next semester. Rethinking some things." I raised an eyebrow. "To what?" She shrugged. "Didn't say. Just, rethinking." She looked at me then, the way mothers do when they're sifting through their children's choices, trying to find the thread that still connects them. He mentioned you, she said after a pause. Said you were the only person who ever told him the truth. That made my throat tighten, not in pride, but in something heavier. Something like grief for the years we all spent pretending. You did the right thing, she said quietly. I didn't answer. Not because I disagreed, but because I wasn't sure if doing the right thing had ever felt so much like standing alone in a crowded room. Christmas passed. New Year's came. The world moved on. One morning I opened that letter again, reread it slowly, and closed it just as carefully. I didn't write back. I didn't need to. Some truths didn't require replies. They just needed to be witnessed. Then spring came, soft and early. The campus turned to a mosaic of rust and green. One morning I passed a group of freshmen arguing over some essay due in another class. I almost interrupted, almost told them the answer didn't matter as much as the question, but I didn't. I just walked past, a little amused, a little lighter. That day in my lecture, I let the students debate longer than usual. One girl raised her hand near the end, cheeks flushed with the urgency of thought. Professor, she said, is it okay if I disagree with the author completely? I smiled. If you don't, then what are we doing here? Laughter. Relief. Curiosity. All the things that used to feel scarce in that room began to return. A few weeks later, my mom called. We're doing Easter brunch, she said. Just something small. If you feel like stopping by. I did. Not because I had to. Not for appearances. Not to keep her from fielding questions. I went because I wanted to. Because I didn't feel invisible anymore, not to myself. When I arrived, there was no big announcement. No awkward silence. Just a nod from Uncle Frank, a smile from Ray, a plate of warm food pressed into my hands. And on the sideboard, next to the decorative eggs and half-wilted tulips, sat a stack of books. Not family albums. Not magazines. Books. Mine. Later, as I stepped out onto the porch, I heard someone say behind me, he's the one who taught Dylan, right? It wasn't loud. It wasn't public. But it was enough. I didn't need a parade. I didn't need another toast. I didn't even need them to understand everything. I just needed to be seen. And I was. Finally. Not all validation comes in the form of applause. In fact, some of the most important moments in life happen in silence, when no one's watching, no one's clapping, and you're forced to confront the version of yourself you've been carrying all along. What this story teaches isn't about victory in the conventional sense. It's not about getting the last word or proving someone wrong for the sake of ego. It's about something far quieter, far more difficult, being seen on your own terms, even when no one is willing to look. For much of our lives, we're taught to chase recognition. We measure our worth in titles, trophies, degrees, and the number of heads that turn when we enter a room. But when those things don't come or come late, or arrive and still leave us feeling hollow, we begin to understand something deeper. Visibility isn't about volume. It's about truth. The central character in this story lived in the margins for years, not because he lacked substance, but because others didn't know where to place him. He didn't fit their narrative of success. He wasn't loud. He wasn't flashy. He didn't climb corporate ladders or marry into spectacle. He read. He taught. He cared. And for that, he was often overlooked. Dismissed. Reduced to a footnote in a family addicted to highlight reels. But still, he persisted. Still, he showed up. He graded papers. He stayed late. He held his students accountable. And when no one else saw that effort, he saw it himself. That is the first and perhaps most crucial life lesson here. You have to validate your own work before the world does. If you're waiting for applause before you believe in yourself, you will starve emotionally. Because applause is inconsistent. It's political. It's selective. Sometimes, the people who should cheer the loudest are the ones who never clap. Not because you aren't good, but because your growth threatens the version of you they've built their comfort on. The second lesson is about truth, and how it doesn't need to shout to be heard. In a world trained to equate volume with power, this story reminds us of the quiet strength that lives in a calm voice saying something that matters. Funny. I'm his professor. That one sentence changed the entire dynamic. It didn't attack. It didn't defend. It simply revealed. And in that moment, every assumption fell away. Truth doesn't always need a stage. Sometimes, it just needs a chair at the table, and the courage to sit in it. There's also a lesson in accountability, especially for those like Dylan, who grew up being clapped for, even when they hadn't earned it. We often mistake potential for entitlement. Dylan was bright, but he wasn't curious. He was impressive, but he wasn't grounded. He assumed the world would keep applauding as long as he played the part. But when that applause stopped, when he had to look into the eyes of someone who saw through the performance, he realized that effort, not image, is what earns respect. And in his willingness to admit that, to write that letter, to say, "You freed me," there's a deeper revelation: humility is not weakness. It's the beginning of growth. The most powerful change comes not when someone tells you who you are, but when you allow yourself to question who you've been pretending to be. For anyone who's ever felt invisible, this story also offers a subtle but powerful reminder: you don't have to perform to deserve a seat. The world may not always see your work. Your family may not understand your value. But that doesn't mean your presence isn't meaningful. Sometimes, the best revenge isn't revenge at all. It's truth. It's stillness. It's showing up with the full weight of your history and saying, "This is who I am. And I'm not asking for permission anymore." Lastly, this story reminds us that legacy is not built through grand gestures, but through small, consistent integrity. The protagonist didn't win because he made a speech. He won because he stayed true to his values, even when it was easier to disappear. He held the line. He did the work. And when it was time to speak, he spoke with clarity, not bitterness. In the end, he didn't need to be cheered. He just needed to be seen. And maybe that's all any of us are really searching for: not the applause, not the spotlight, but the moment someone looks at us without agenda or expectation and simply says, "I see you." So here's the lesson, wrapped in silence and honesty: do your work. Tell your truth. Don't wait for the room to clap. Wait for the mirror to nod. Because that's the applause that will stay with you. Long after the room quiets. Long after the lights go out. Long after the headlines fade. Sometimes, being seen is the loudest thing you'll ever say.